Mental hospital employees of Reddit. Hoth the scariest patient you've ever had to deal with. I worked at a mental hospital for about 5 years. The scariest patient and incident involved a patient that had just had surgery to remove an object that she swallowed. I'm down the hall when I hear a nurse scream for help. I run to the patient's room and she had opened up her stapled shut incision and was holding what looked like part of her intestines in her hands. Blood was everywhere. She didn't seem to feel anything though and just looked like we were interrupting her. I almost fainted from the sight. I quit that job shortly after. Man, there are a lot of scary cases when you work in pediatric mental health, mostly because of the age. I recently had a kiddo come in who has a history of killing animals in the neighborhood, skinning and impaling cats, crushing glass shards into dog food, and leaving it at the park. Some fricked up shoot that is definitely indicative of some serious underlying issues. The scary thing is that the parents were basically okay with this behavior until the kid woke his parents up in the middle of the night by plunging a huge knife, more like a meat cleaver, into their mattress directly between them while they were sleeping. He wasn't sleepwalking and seemed perfectly aware of what he was doing. When they asked him what he was doing and why he just did that, he told them he wanted to kill them to see if your insides are like S, which was the name of the neighbor's cat that he impaled on a spiked fence post a couple weeks prior. Edit. Spillingerdic 2. Remove some possibly remotely identifying factors just in case. It's a small freaking world. I met a 5 to 6 year old girl who was in an inpatient treatment center for trying to smother her newborn brother. She said she wanted him to die because her parents liked him too much. She would go from being a sweet, overly affectionate child to suddenly despising a person and wishing death on them. The hospital wanted to release her after a few days and the parents refused to take her back that soon. Department of Family Services ended up getting involved. I wonder how common behavior like this is. I was 4 when my brother was born and had a complete meltdown over the fact that he was a boy. I despised him from day one and was always horrible to him when we were kids, but it never even occurred to me to hurt him, let alone kill him. I guess I just know that it's very common for the oldest child to be less than enthused about a new baby and even express hatred for the baby, but trying to kill the baby. I wonder how common that is. In the 90s I worked overnight and weekend security at a center for psychiatry that cared for inpatients, outpatients, and even criminally insane awaiting trial. That area of the building was basically a prison. Police would often bring in the arrested for evaluation and the homeless could even walk in and ask for help. We saw all kinds. I did this job 4 years and some nights got very busy. 2 scary situations really stick out from those times. The first, I was manning the front desk and a walk-in patient holding a knife walks in screaming, "I want to kill myself." He had cut himself all over his body and was covered in blood. My supervisor quickly rifled through the database and found him. History of violence against staff, AIDS, hepatitis, and more. I was commanded to put him down. I approached him with a chair as a shield. When he wound up to swing the knife at me, I rammed him with the chair until he went down. Then a bunch of staff jumped in and everybody put one foot on him until he was better subdued and eventually sedated. A doctor was in my face right afterwards yelling, "Did he touch you? Did he cut you?" I wasn't sure until after an examination. The second incident started when 2 police bring in a tough looking guy for assessment. This guy's keeping his head down, not saying anything. I lead them to a secure observation room. The arrested and 1 officer goes in. The other cop returns with me to get our information and to see if has in our database. Suddenly my partner, who was watching the monitors, jumps up, hits the alarm and runs back the way we came. We run after. The door is opened and we see the guy wailing on the officer with his handcuffs like a one-handed flail. The other cop does most of the work in this case and the arrested is pretty much laid out on the floor. How did this happen? How the frick did this happen? In my quick inspection I notice that his hands are funny. They're all covered in blood from the fight, but something isn't right. I look closer. This guy doesn't have a thumb. Even the ball socket that attaches the thumb to the palm has been removed. The cop looks at the other hand. Holy shoot. Both thumbs removed. They cuffed this guy and didn't notice he was missing both thumbs. The cuffs would just slide off. I still think about that guy. How? Why? For what reason? What crazy world was he a part of where something like that could happen? I still wonder. I've just had screamers so far, but 2 of my colleagues have been punched by patients. No warning signs. 1 second they're talking normally, the next second bam. One co-worker had a broken nose, the other got a concussion, and was in rehab for a year. Inpatient psych workers are basically tough as nails. I did work experience at a hospital, and got put on the adolescent psychiatric ward, to shadow a doctor for half a day. There was a kid who was refusing to eat who had a tube connected to him force feeding him, and he had a look in his eyes, like he wanted to kill you. It was really sad. The nurses said he just wanted to die, and hated everyone for stopping him. I don't work in a mental hospital, but am a frequent patient. I was on the ward for about 30 seconds and they were taking my vitals when an enormous bear of a human being screams fuck at the top of his lungs over and over again. He ran down the hallway and got right up in the face of a very petite medtech and was screaming that he owned her eyeballs. One of the patients came and stood between him and the nurse, and it really seemed like he was going to attack her. Finally they gave him a shot in the ass with Haldol, and he went down. He did the same freaking thing for the next 3 nights, until he actually tried choking someone, and they sent him to a more intensive unit. My mother is a K-2 special ed teacher, and had a little girl I will never forget. Her parents were very white trash looking, and were in jail for trying to kill each other, so she was a ward of her elderly grandparents. She had behavioral issues, and would get violent sometimes. One day her grandmother told my mom she walked in on the girl, she was almost 5 in the lit living room squatting in the cat's kitty litter, having just had a bowel movement and now vigorously fingering herself in the front while watching the TV, which was on a channel that had that old blizzard effect you got when there was no signal. My mom had to call the state to have her put in a secure facility. By the time the state came she had set fire to their house. I often wonder what happened to her. She'd be well into her 20s by now. I have a patient that frequently engages in rectal digging. Along with this rectal digging, a part of his syndrome is an extremely high pain tolerance. During one of my shifts I hear one of my co-workers screaming at this patient, so I of course ran to see what was going on. My patient was naked in his bed, covered in fresh and dried blood. My co-worker then explained to me she just caught him with his fist up his asshole right before I walked in. I then had to have him spread open his butt cheeks to see what was actually going on down there, and, in fact, the blood was coming from his rectum. The nurse who was in charge told me to get him in the shower, and when he stood up about 10 golf ball sized blood clots fell out of his ass. I was repulsed and yelled for my co-worker to come back and look. The nurse then said to continue giving him a shower. My co-worker both looked at each other and said frick that as we proceeded to call 911. Blood still was dropping at this point, so I had him sit down on a towel until the ambulance came. After a few hours at the ER they said he had completely scratched out his rectum and made his already existent hemorrhoids gaping wounds. I have been working at this place for going on 8 years and have plenty more stories like this one. I think him so desensitized to anything disgusting I could probably eat a turkey sandwich in one hand and clean up bodily fluids with the other. This probably will pale in comparison to others. Had an older lady who by all accounts was doing fine. Had our daily sit down one day, she was in good spirits and was actually due to go home within the next corporal days. Then, something happened. Her daughter came to visit and wanted her to stay a bit longer, and apparently this triggered something. Fast forward to the next day and find her sitting on her bed having pulled out most of her hair. She looks possessed, in a somewhat catatonic state. I try to engage her in talk, but all she can will say ask is did I hurt you? Little bit later she craps all over herself. She got transferred somewhere else real quick. The transformation in less than 24 hours was something I still can't wrap my head around. Edit. Oh wow. Just read the other submissions. Yep, mine doesn't come close. LOL. My father is a police officer and regularly gets posted in the mental hospital, which yields some interesting experiences. This is not so much crazy as it is humorous, but this one always gets me. It was just a regular day as he is simply monitoring and being available for hospital staff towards the reception area when a woman in hospital gowns from the end of a long hallway locks eyes and begins to make her way over to my father. Meanwhile, my father is just trying to somehow mentally prepare for the inevitable encounter he is about to have with this patient. Once said woman finally arrives where my father was standing, she looks at him with disgust and says, "Are you just going to stand there and do nothing?" Confused, he replies, "Excuse me, mom," and with a loud shout the woman exclaimed, "I have dynamite up my ass, and it's going to go off any second. Are you just gonna stand there?" Rightfully so, my father remains there baffled by the encounter and requests one of the staff members attend to the patient. We had a guy that would constantly shove things down his urethra, and I mean anything, to the point where he can't even have paper in his room or he would roll it up and jam it in there too. Also, anytime he had any sutures or stitches he would rip them open right in front of you if he felt like he wasn't getting enough attention. There's a million other things, but I don't want to go into detail to not breach confidentiality. He's pretty memorable. My father used to work in the VA and I got to hear some horror stories. I can't recall any in particular, but there were several vets with PTSD who would often go straight to Vietnam mode, essentially having a Rambo-esque freakout. Didn't work at one, but was a patient in a psych ward for a bit. I had two friends in there, let's call them John and Eric. John was perfectly fine, just a little depressed, and his family was worried about him. So they sent him to a psych ward, probably not the best method, maybe try therapy first. I assumed Derek was the same. He seemed to have a loving family that visited when they were allowed, until one day we were playing some Wii bowling, and Eric turned towards John and I mid-game. He says has been having bad dreams. Immediately I say, "Oh, drive. So-and-so has a pill for that." It helped me, the psych ward, like a lot. Over-medicated out the ass, but I thought it was normal to get a pill for every little problem. Eric turns to me and says, "I've seen you die every night since I got here. I can see the blood rushing down your face. I can't wait to see it again." The second he reached for the craft scissors on the table, mistakenly left out for whatever reason, John knocked him down, and I ran to get help. He shot himself about 6 months ago, and I went to visit his grave because I didn't believe it. I was in an inpatient pediatric unit for a brief period of time when I was about 10, depression, suicidal, nothing too out there. There was a little girl there about 5 who had basically been her parents' sex slave her entire life. She had been removed from multiple foster homes because she kept molesting the other kids. She was a sweet kid, but you couldn't play with her at all because she always wanted to play house, which involved simulating 6 acts. Everything in this poor kid's life revolved around sex, and whenever she was disciplined she would try to have sex with the staff members to try and make up. It was creepy when I was a kid, but as an adult it's even more horrifying to think that this poor little girl was basically brainwashed by some sick assholes. I have no idea what happened to her, but I really hope she found some peace in life, and that her parents died in an oil rig fire begging for their lives to an uncaring God. Worked in a facility in New York State that housed 6 offenders. One of them was a serial killer. Had been convicted twice of homicide and linked to a third. He was in his 50s, older and gray-haired, and not particularly large. He rarely if ever spoke to others. Occasionally other inmates, seeing how quiet he was, would try to intimidate or bully him. This small mild man would get a creepy look on his face and his eyes would dark, his jaw would clench, and he'd start to breathe hard, and then just as suddenly it would pass. He'd look at the other person and say, "I could just kill you." Wouldn't yell or even raise his voice. Then he'd walk off. I saw him do that twice, and I have no doubt the face I saw for just a second was the one his victim saw right before he killed them. It was some scary shoot. Scared me, and both times scared the other inmates he spoke to. He didn't say it as a threat. It was more a statement of fact, the words of a man who could and had killed others before, with little difficulty and no remorse. In person, that's some creepy shoot. So I'm currently working in an inpatient psychiatric hospital to get experience for grad school, and the setting I work in is specifically for patients who need stabilization, e.g. off their meds / need to get back on them in a crisis. I've worked on almost every unit in the hospital, so maybe a month ago, I was doing a night shift on the schizophrenia unit. The staff told me about a particular patient on one of the wings. That one does not sleep at night and 2 has been attacking male staff. I'm a 56, 140 pounds male, not very intimidating. So I get out onto the unit. This patient comes out, has probably like 58, 160 pounds burly guy. Definitely could take me down if he wanted to, and I introduced myself to him, etc. Now anytime this patient would talk to you, he would whisper, so it was very hard to hear him, but naturally he would get upset the more times you asked him to repeat himself, and it showed on his face. So at one point he pokes his head out of his door while I'm doing my observation rounds and whispers something to me while gesturing for me to come to his room. So I'm standing at the threshold of his doorway and he asks me to come into his room. I was extremely hesitant, obviously, because I wasn't trying to get hit. So this patient noticed that and clear as day, no whispering, said, "Come on man, I ain't gonna hit you." I almost shoot my pants when he said that, but against my instincts I went into his room anyway because he might actually need help with something. Then he starts closing the door, and in my head I'm just like frick. Turns out all he wanted was to show me this picture behind his door. It was a picture of this very cute baby in a flower costume that he seemed to get a kick out of. That was a long night. Not a mental hospital, but group home for psychologically disturbed teens. Had one girl come from the hospital heavily medicated due to very violent behaviors. Usually had slow movement and response, slack-jawed, eyes half shut and spaced out. The other girls picked on her a lot because of it. One of the staff had told her once that she should stand up for herself. She turned slowly to the staff and said, "Miss, those girls don't deserve what I can do to them."
End.
I worked on the overpass shift at this place way out in the sticks. To give some background, the idea was that if you could remove the patient from whatever caused them stress, it would help them get better, and this place used to be an old ski resort. Anyway, most nights people would be in bed by 11, so it was usually pretty, except for the off patient who couldn't sleep and would just chill and talk with us. This one guy, let's call him Mike, was pretty worse for wear and was having some trouble telling what was real and what was fake. So he comes into my office where me and another counselor were and tells us he thinks he saw something in the hallway. All 3 of us go into the hall to show him that everything was okay when a mass of hair comes out of a room, floats around for a couple seconds, and goes back in. Needless to say, we're all freaked out and run back to the office. Immediately following it, I run back to the room it entered to try and catch it. There were no other patients in the room at all. I don't know what I saw, but the place had a history and it shook us all up. I had another patient who had a schizophrenic break during college, was super religiously preoccupied, i.e. obsessed with having only kosher foods, talking about how she was one of the only black Orthodox Jews. She would play in her menstrual blood as a ritual and make art with it on construction paper and hand them out to other patients and wipe it on her room door. Before she was admitted, she was masturbating with hunting knives. She also lived in college housing and had roommates where she would smear her menstrual blood on their community door. One day she got pissed off and broke a glass mug into pieces, put the broken pieces in cake batter and baked cupcakes, then served them to everyone she was living with and then some.